Welcome everyone. Thanks for coming to our meeting for the New York City Neighborhood Naturalist Group, which is part of the New York City EcoFlora project. My name is Lydia Paradiso, and I'm a doctoral student at the New York Botanical Garden and a graduate fellow working with the NYC EcoFlora project. NYBG first created the EcoFlora back in 2017 with a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. The EcoFlora program is a community science project with three main goals: to investigate urban ecosystems and urbanization, to support open source biodiversity data, and to increase understanding and appreciation of plant life. To date, nearly 30,000 observers have made over 830,000 observations of plants and their biotic partners in New York City using iNaturalist. You can explore these observations on the project page on iNaturalist, which I will link in the chat. You can also check out our YouTube page that has recordings of some of our past talks. And if you will have to leave this talk early or you would like to share this talk with someone, we'll also have a recording of this posted there by next week. Before I turn it over to Tomi to do some more introductions for tonight's talk, I just want to give some announcements about some other upcoming events that we have going on. Next Monday, October 3rd at 5 p.m., we'll have our October talk that will be given by Dr. Mary Gardner from the Ohio State University. That will be on the value of vacant land for urban bees. So here's another link if you would like to register for that talk. We also will have some more events planned for October, including a BioBlitz in the Bronx and a plant awareness chalk walk in Brooklyn. So keep your eye out in your email for more updates. Or if you would like to follow us on Eventbrite, it will notify you when more info and registration for those events and future events go live. So now I will turn over to Tomi.
All right. So hello, everybody. I would like to begin by doing a land acknowledgement for the First Nation people of New York State. But being that me and Dr. Is it Meineke? Is that how you? Meineke, cool. That we are in California. I'd like to extend that to all the First Nation people of California as well. So I'd like to begin by recognizing the original people of this land of New York and California, the Lenape, as well as many other First Nation people, and the deep connection to the Lenape-Hoking, as well as Turtle Island, the homeland. As an organization dedicated to advocating for the plant world, we must acknowledge those who are the original stewards of the land. And we believe in the importance of acknowledging the settler colonial genocide perpetrated against these communities and the rest, all of the communities, and the resilience of the First Nation people who still today continue to resist erasure. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight. So Dr. Emily Meineke earned her doctoral degree at North Carolina State University in the Department of Entomology, where she pioneered research characterizing the effects of urban heat island effect on insects and herbivores. As a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University Herbaria, she studied how urbanization and climate change have affected plant-insect relationships worldwide over the past 100 plus years. Emily is joined the faculty as an assistant professor of urban landscape entomology in the Department of Entomology and Nematology at the University of California, Davis in 2020. And she likes to be outside with her dogs, run, and do CrossFit. Self-proclaimed poorly, but so without further ado, here is our speaker for tonight.
Thank you, Tomi and Lydia, for inviting me here. Can I get a thumbs up if folks can hear me? I just want to make sure I'm being heard. Okay, great. I also want to say I recently gave a talk just after Mary Gardner, who is your next speaker at a conference. And man, is she inspiring. I hope everyone will go to that talk too. She's just really incredible. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about mostly some of my doctoral work and then a little bit about some of the work that my lab is doing now. And all of that work focuses around trees in cities in particular. particular. So urban forests, probably most of you know, they shield us from solar radiation, which actually has a striking effect on skin cancer rates. And they also clean the air of pollutants. And just in general, being in the presence of trees makes people a lot happier. And so one of the goals of our lab and of my work so far has been trying to facilitate having these trees in cities in the future, even as urban conditions become sort of more and more extreme with both climate change and the acceleration of urbanization itself. So this is an image of Sacramento, California, which is sort of the nearest urban forest to where I am now, but my work started in Raleigh, North Carolina. And I'm just going to sort of jump into what my PhD project looked like. And it started with sort of two observations about trees in cities. So a lot of times trees in cities look like this. This is more of a mature urban forest. It's also true that people are continually planting trees in cities to try and make sure that this urban green infrastructure keeps going over time. So a lot of times trees are actually in what I would say here is a super hot environment surrounded by pavement. And so the first observation of this project was, hey, you know, a lot of trees are hotter than a lot of other nearby trees simply because where they're planted. So in particular, you know, the difference between urban temperatures and rural temperatures is between 1 and 12 degrees centigrade, which is quite a lot, but there's also a lot of variation within the city from tree to tree in terms of how much temperature warming they're experiencing. So the second observation, and I'm just going to read this quote by this entomologist named Joseph Putnam about insect herbivores, so things that act pretty pesty on these trees. So another feature of their distribution is that they are very rare occurrences in the country while they become excessively abundant in cities and towns. And what he was talking about is small, soft-bodied pests that make their home and their lunch out of plants. And basically he was looking at plants like red maple, plants like various species of oaks, and he would see tons and tons of these little mites, which are on the left side of your screen, and aphids on the right side of your screen on these plants, but not in the city, but not outside the city so much. So putting these two observations together, at the beginning of my PhD, one of the things that I predicted might be the cause of this longstanding mystery in the field of plant-insect interactions is that maybe the insects in cities were doing better because it was warmer for them. So insects are ectothermic, and at least in the temperate part of the world, a lot of them are living below what we call their thermal maximum, which is the temperature at which their fitness declines, their survival declines, and they do poorly. So in general, since the insects living in the temperate zone often are living below their thermal maxima, any sort of warming that you give them helps them to do better. So that was the prediction that I had when I started this work, and people had tested all kinds of alternative hypotheses for why insects were doing better in cities than outside cities and hadn't really come up with a satisfactory conclusion. So I started with this prediction of the effects of urban warming on soft-bodied pests on trees, and I had to pick a particular tree species to focus on. And I chose willow oak, which is Quercus phellos. It's this giant tree in the left side of your screen that wouldn't even fit within my camera lens. It is the second most commonly planted tree across the southeastern US and the most commonly planted shade tree, meaning large tree that, again, protects us against some of the things I was talking about earlier, poor air quality and elevated exposure to UV that's there without the trees. And its major pest is called, it's really not very charismatically named, but it's called the Oaklicanium scale insect, Parthenolicanium quercifex. If I refer to scale insects for the rest of the talk, I'm referring to these guys. And just in case you're not familiar with scale insects, I hope you're not, because they're really annoying as pests in your garden and on houseplants. They're these little, like the ones that I worked on at least, the Parthenolecanium quercefax scale insects are basically a bump on a log. So throughout their evolutionary history, they've lost most of their limbs and their body parts, and instead of walking around like normal insects do, they insert their mouth part into the plant and essentially anchor themselves and act like a parasite on the plant. So if you're to make a cross section of that little bump on a log of an insect, what you would see is that we have the insect's body up here on the top, cross-sectioned, and then it has this straw-like, more like a hair-like mouth part that it snakes throughout the vascular tissue of the plant. And in particular, these scale insects feed on phloem, which carries the products of photosynthesis, so photosynthate, throughout the plant. And the thing about photosynthate is that it's full of sugar. And so the product of photosynthesis, one of the products is sugar that the plant can then use. But what that also means for this insect is that because nitrogen is a limiting nutrient, it has to expel a ton of that sugar water in order to meet its nitrogen demands compared to its demands for sugar. And so that means that they poop out all of this sugar water that you might have seen actually on your car in the spring. So there's sometimes this rain of sap, and that's actually insect frass or insect poop that's on your car. And often that sap, or insect honeydew is what we call it, it lands on the upper layers of leaves as well on those same plants, or sometimes in understory plants. And this fungus called sooty mold can grow on the honeydew and feed on those sugars. And the thing about this sooty mold is that it also blocks photosynthesis. So it doesn't allow the plant to replace the photosynthate that it's lost from the insects feeding. So the insects are essentially having this double effect on the plant, where they are inhibiting photosynthesis through the sooty mold, and they're actually removing the products of photosynthesis that are there. So they can be pretty damaging despite the fact that they're relatively small. And I should say also, you might have noticed that that sort of bump on a log insect that we saw, the brown, bump, there's no other way to say it, that is so convex because in addition to having its mouth part inserted, it's sort of creating eggs underneath its body at the same time. So it acts like as an egg sac for itself. And these insects can produce up to 4,000 eggs. So it's on average between 2,000 and 4,000 eggs. So their populations go up really quickly as well. So this is the study system that I was working with. And after getting that all buttoned up, then I needed to find a way to find trees that were living in different temperature zones within the city, again, to test the hypothesis that urban warming was the thing that was leading to more insects on these trees. And I should just quickly break down what urban warming is, or the urban heat island effect. So the way that it happens is that radiation from the sun hits buildings and or sidewalks or asphalt or any hard surface that's installed in a city. And then that heat comes up out of the sidewalk, and then the trees are actually exposed to all of that heat, just like we are. And so that's to say that if you are a tree that's surrounded by more pavement, you're going to be warmer than a surrounding tree that's not. And that's probably obvious to most people here, but I just want to emphasize that that's what we're looking at here. Okay, so I got this. Let's see if this will let me advance. I got this satellite thermal layer of Raleigh, North Carolina from basically like an open source data. So these data are sort of available to everybody on Landsat through the Landsat data packages. And this black line represents the edge of the county that Raleigh, North Carolina is in. And then this area is sort of the center of town. And the dark red areas are hotter than the cool bluer areas. And so basically, if you were to fly into RDU International Airport, the nearby state park would be something like 12 degrees centigrade cooler than RDU Airport. And that's at the surface. So the surface that's being measured in the airport is the the cement layer that the planes take off from, and then Umstead State Park, it's being measured from the tops of the trees. So whatever the satellite hits, but that's still quite a big difference in temperature. And if we zoom in on this little rectangle here in the bottom, I just want to demonstrate that if we overlay a map of Raleigh city street trees, there are trees that are growing within something like 200 meters of one another that are experiencing completely different thermal conditions. So I chose 20 sites with 2 trees in these hotter red areas across the city, and 20 sites with 2 trees in these cooler blue areas of the city, and went and collected insects from all of those trees to figure out the relationship between urban heat and insect abundance. So this is my brother. He helped me with this pole pruner. And the wonderful thing about scale insects is that they don't move when you clip a branch. So you can just clip a branch and take it back to the lab and count the insects that are dormant on those branches in the wintertime. So I also put eye buttons, which are these temperature monitoring devices, in the canopies of the trees to make sure that the trees that were hotter on the satellite image were actually hotter in real life in terms of their air temperature, and they were, and you'll just have to trust me because I don't have time to show you those data. So I took the branches back to the lab, and this is what it looks like to count scale insects under a microscope. And I did this just forever, so much counting. And it paid off because I did find some pretty striking results. And so hotter urban trees have more scale insects on them. That is the take-home point of these graphs. So on the horizontal axis here, we have cold trees in those cool blue areas of the map, and then we have hot trees in those warm red areas. And then on the vertical axis is the abundance of various different life stages of these scale insects on the trees. So depending on the life stage, there were between 5 and 9 times more scale insects on the hotter trees than on the cooler trees. And so this was a really striking result that I was able to base the rest of my PhD work on. And in particular, I was interested in understanding something that I think is a natural next question for a grad student, which is, well, what exactly is the mechanism? Why are scale insects more abundant in hotter areas within the city? And I'm going to give you a couple of answers, and then I'm going to talk through how I got there. So one of the answers to that question that I found is that the scale insects survive better in warmer environments. So they sort of just love the way that warmer environments, what they do for their fitness. So we had this environmental chamber experiment where basically I went into the field back to my study trees. And during the spring, when the females were producing eggs underneath, this is one of those, again, convex sort of bumps on a log where there are thousands of eggs underneath this female. Brought eggs back from hot sites and cool sites and placed them in hotter and cooler greenhouses that had temperatures that mimicked the ones that we saw in the field. And basically what I found is this. So we have the scale insect abundance on the experimental trees in the greenhouse on the vertical axis. And then the horizontal axis is cooler greenhouse, hotter greenhouse. And the colors represent scales from hot sites and scales from cool sites. And that was a lot, but don't worry, I'm going to explain it. So in the cooler greenhouse, we see a little bit of a benefit of being from a hotter urban tree. And so what this means is that there is some fitness advantage to being from a hotter urban environment that carries over from the actual city into the greenhouse. We don't know exactly what it is, but the take home is that hotter scales are happier. In the warmer greenhouse, it's almost the same story, except for the scale insects from a hotter site that were placed in a hotter greenhouse did better than scale insects in any other treatment. And what this suggests is that there is some either maternal effect or adaptive effect, where the scale insects at hotter sites in the city have actually adapted to those hotter conditions, which allows them to survive better, reproduce more, and have basically a better life in hotter environments. So that's one answer. The scale insects survive better in warmer environments. And another answer is that in these hotter environments, in multiple ways, natural enemies are less effective. And what I mean by natural enemies are predators, or what I'm about to talk about are parasitoids. So parasitoid wasps are these tiny little creatures that are between like 0.5 millimeter or less to like a couple of millimeters long. Usually they're pretty small. And what they do is they lay an egg in their host. So typically that's another insect or a spider. That egg hatches and then eats the host either from the inside out or the outside out. And so some parasitoids will lay their egg on the outside, for instance, of a caterpillar, and then they'll feed as a larva on that caterpillar from the outside. Sometimes they're actually inside the body of the host, so sort of like an alien situation. And that's the case with these scale insects. So what I found by doing a series of field work on these insects is that there were something like 17 different morphospecies, different essentially species of parasitoids that attack these scale insects in the field. So you can imagine evolutionarily, these insects that sort of hang around, don't move very much. That's kind of a big opportunity for a community of predators or parasitoids that are trying to make a living. So the way that I figured out that there were 17 of these parasitoid species is that I brought branches back from the field from hot and cold sites, and I put them in little vials with cotton on the top. And then I just let the parasitoids emerge from the scale insects. So after their larvae and they've completed their eclosion or their sort of cocoon stage going into an adult, they chew their way outside of the insect. And that's the stage at which I caught them and counted them. And I looked at the scale insects from hotter and cooler areas to see which parasitoids were emerging from them, but additionally to see how many eggs were produced in parasitized and unparasitized scale insects. And it turns out that a lot of these parasitoid wasps, when they're inserted into the scale insect can continue to produce thousands of eggs, just like it does, and also sort of incubate that parasitoid or allow that parasitoid to grow inside of it. And so the parasitoid really isn't having that much of an effect on fitness because the scale insects are still able to produce eggs and complete their life cycle. That's the exception. There's one exception, and that's this parasitoid that's not pictured here, but is pictured here, called Incertus fuscus. So this is like from 3 a.m. in the lab one day. That's not something that I recommend PhD students do, but things were different back then. And I worked until 3 a.m. quite a lot. And this is Incertus fuscus. This is a multi-layered image. This is actually less than 2 millimeters long, and it's emerging from a scale insect. And the thing about these parasitoids that maybe you can see, maybe you can't because I'm so attuned to this, but this scale insect that it's coming out of has not been able to produce any eggs. Its entire body has been taken up by the development of the parasitoid, which means that this parasitoid is the one that reduces the fitness of the scale insects the most out of all of the parasitoids. So I found that parasitism by this particular species drops linearly from 20% at the coolest sites to 5% at the hottest sites. So these parasitoids are having a much bigger effect in cooler areas than in warmer areas of the city on the scale insects. And it seems to be something about just the warmer areas are outside the range of the temperatures that these parasitoids are able to tolerate. Okay. So moving on to non-parasitoid predators and things that affect these scale insects. So I wanted to get sort of a broader idea of the species interactions and the food webs in these street trees. I got really interested when I found all these parasitoids like in the middle of the city. And I wanted to know what's living on these trees and what makes up these food webs. And so I worked with a postdoc in our lab, Elsa Youngstedt, and we came up, she mostly built this contraption, which basically you hoist up into the tree canopy and you pull a string, which opens this top lid here, and you put foliage into it, and then you pull the string and you sort of beat the foliage using this top. And into the actual funnel goes the insects, and they fall into a vial, which you attach right here. So this is basically a way of beat sampling that does a pretty good job of capturing like small arthropods. And the overwhelming result that I found was that there were spiders all over these trees. And so if we look at the most common species by abundance per sample here on the horizontal axis, we have, coccinellids, which are beetles, ants, we have predatory mites, but of course, spiders are way more abundant than any other group. And I had actually noticed this myself, bringing plants back to the lab, or plant samples rather, and I would just sit at the microscope and be covered in spiders. And it was so uncomfortable because I was so afraid of spiders. And this really desensitized me to having them around. And so I guess I wasn't that surprised when we ended up finding so many spiders in these trees. And in particular, the most abundant spider were anaphanids. So there are these ghost spiders that happen to be a lot more common than any other spider in our sampling. And they make these cute little funnel webs. I actually grew quite fond of them over time. And this is the spider, just in case that's a little bit hard to see because they are a little camouflaged. And then of course, these are the scale insects right here, also in the image. So we found that just like the parasitoids, these spiders, which are presumably making a meal of something in the tree, we don't know exactly what, it might be scale insects, their presence goes down with summer average temperature. And so it seems like at these hot sites, which are represented by the red dots, that these ghost spiders that are really abundant in these cooler sites just really tend to decline in the hotter areas of the city. Okay, so let's sort of put all of this together. Urban warming increases scale insect abundance on street trees. And so we looked at this actually for a suite of other species, including spider mites, and they also benefit from urban warming as well. And so as cities continue to get warmer from climate change and from intensity of development going up to accommodate more people, more industry, et cetera, our insects might also experience population changes associated with urban warming. Now, in some places and over some periods of time, we might actually see that certain insect pests and predators, as we saw, might decline in response to warming because warming goes above their thermal maxima, or the suite of temperatures that insects are able to tolerate. So when we're looking at why scale insect abundance increases in hotter areas on trees, it has something to do with potentially having these population islands that have adapted and can survive in hot urban conditions. And then we also, at the same time, have reduced parasitism and predation. So no wonder we see higher scale insect abundance in these warmer areas. So we did another experiment, which again, I don't have time to talk about today, where we looked at the effects of insects and heat and water stress, 3 common stressors for urban trees, sort of put together and separately in the greenhouse. And we found that when insects and warming and drought are combined, they have a really strong effect on tree growth. And so if we see the insects increasing in abundance with warming and we see water stress going up, which is happening across a lot of the Western US, we're seeing more drought, we might see even more elevated effects of the insects on growth that we want the trees to be able to achieve, to be able to protect us. Okay, so if cities are canaries in the coal mine, or if they're representative of broader climate warming, we might see more scale insects on trees in more natural areas as the climate warms, at least in areas that are where we're seeing that the insects are below their thermal maxima in terms of temperature. Okay, I'm going to take a quick breath. And I finished off this work. This is basically the thrust of my PhD work. And I didn't study urban trees or insects for about 3 or 4 years. And then I started my position at UC Davis in March of 2020. I don't recommend anyone start a job in March of 2020. And it was tough going there. I'd planned a bunch of research and then it all shut down right away. And I was doing a lot of like walking my dog. And I noticed that we had a lot of trees that were putting out leaves, either their first flush of leaves or their second flush of leaves, right when the COVID shutdown of traffic happened. So basically we went from having a lot of cars in Sacramento and in Davis locally where I live to having like no one on the street. I mean, it's sort of a ghost town. And so I started to wonder what that would mean for interactions between trees and their insect pests. And the reason why I started to wonder that is because Sacramento is a city that is completely covered by highways. And so there's a lot of variation in how much individual trees are exposed to vehicle pollutants. The other thing is that the things that come out of tailpipes are carbon and nitrogen based, and the things that affect insect, like quality of plants for insects, are also carbon and nitrogen based. So there's some suggestion that being next to a highway would have some effects on palatability, so the deliciousness of plants for insects. And so we came out with this preprint that I hope is going to be published soon, which basically shows that, like urban heat, in some situations, vehicle pollution drives elevated insect damage to street trees. So seems to be changing chemically the quality of the leaves for the insects themselves. And so I want to end there a little bit early to make time for questions. And I'll just leave this slide up in case anyone wants to check this out, kind of as advertising, admittedly. And I'm happy to take any of your questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was really great. I know as someone who doesn't have a lot of entomology background, I'm always really fascinated to like learn about a new types of insects. And so I do have a quick question about scale insects. I'm assuming that they have a stage that they are mobile, especially if they're producing so many eggs that they have to, you know, if they were all in the same spot, then that would not really work out for all of them eventually. But so how far would you say that they're able to, will they go to another tree, or will they go to another branch on the same tree? Does it depend?
It's a great question. So I think that that's something that I wanted to actually pursue during my graduate work, is looking at population genetics of these organisms and trying to figure out like, how long does it take to evolve to these hotter conditions? Are there separate populations in these hotter trees? And no one has done that population genetics work to be able to figure out how far these scales disperse. That being said, they have a mobile life stage, and we know that behaviorally, so some scale insects of different species, they will actually like crawl onto bird feet, and that's how they'll disperse, like they're attracted to them. It's also true that the scale insects that I worked with are super flat during their, what we would call their crawler stage. So when they first hatch from their eggs and then crawl out from underneath their mom, they could probably just go like this and the wind would carry them. So we also see that street trees that are, which they're often planted like the same species along roadway for aesthetic reasons probably. And we see that typically, like if you have an infected tree, then you have another one next to it. And so it seems like they're definitely moving from tree to tree. The other mobile stage that they have is that the males look completely different than the females, and they're winged. So they can also go around and like mate with different females. Did I answer your question? I'm not really sure if I did. Okay.
Yes. And it looks like, so Ken, I see you put one of those questions in there, but so if the other one, if you want to ask it out loud, you're free to also, you could unmute yourself if you'd like.
I'm curious about, I'm not really visualizing this right. So does the distance from the cooler areas affect how your findings fall. So, because what I'm wondering is, do the populations of the parasites just have difficulty jumping from one area to the other, or is it that they don't exist at all in areas where they're, hotter areas?
Yeah, so our sites were sort of scattered throughout the city. So there were a lot of hot and cool sites that were pretty close together that still had really different predator and parasitoid communities. And so we accounted for, distance of the sites from one another to try to figure out if that was really important. And it seemed not to be. What seemed to be more important is how warm a site is. And so they could be like functionally what that looks like on the ground is that, they could avoid areas that appear too warm or too open for them. The parasitoids do, the scale insects aren't mobile, but the parasitoids are, so they can make behavioral choices about where they go. And so they might be avoiding those areas. They also might be laying their eggs in those hotter trees and the insects in hotter trees, and then their young are just not able to complete development. That's also another possibility.
I also wonder if the size of the tree bed had any effect, because they could get more water or maybe have more soil nutrients if they were in larger tree beds.
Yeah, so we looked at a measure of water stress in the trees that allows you to see like how much water is essentially flowing through the trees. And it's true that the hotter trees are more water stressed. They're just like drier in general. But that doesn't seem to correlate all that well with parasitism or with the scale insects themselves. The insects just seem to really care a lot more about temperature than anything else. But that, that varies by system too. Like my colleague, Adam Dale, worked in a different system on similar questions in Raleigh, and he found that the water stress of the trees was really important for determining the nutritional quality of the trees for the insects he was looking at. So there's a lot of variability from system to system in terms of what matters. But in this system, warming matters a lot.
Thank you.
A related question that we have in the chat from Ken, can the thermal maxima that insects can tolerate potentially be increasing due to climate change?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And basically, as an insect, you have a couple of choices, right? I mean, in an evolutionary sense, you can essentially extend your range poleward with climate change and cease to exist in areas where your thermal maximum is overshot as the climate warms. You can, or you can acclimate, or you can actually adapt to where, the range of temperatures at which you thrive changes. And I don't think anyone has a great answer to the extent to which like lots of insects are adapting to climate conditions. But there have been some studies showing that they do have that capacity. I would say that it probably varies a lot from insect to insect because they're incredibly diverse and their life histories are incredibly diverse. But insects that have larger populations also have, more diverse genes and are usually able to handle environmental perturbations better because they are more likely to be able to have like the genetic diversity to be able to adapt. And so it seems likely to me that these insects that have really big populations are going to be more likely to be able to adapt. So unfortunately, pesky species with lots of genetic diversity are probably going to be better able to adapt to climate change.
And that just makes me think it's always interesting to think about things that are, I mean, they are pests, but that, they will be doing better. Like it's good for them in some sense. Like, I'm glad that someone might be able to, that they have traits that they'll be able to survive. It's just, it is a shame that it's at the expense of, whatever else that they're, taking over.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, the way I've come to think about climate change is more in terms of like winners and losers than anything else. Like there are a small number of species that do really well in the face of urbanization and climate change. And then there is a lot of biodiversity is falling into the loser pile.
Hopefully though, the like insects or predators that the pesky insects support also sort of have like a cascading success. The predators that eat them and that rely on their existence as well.
Totally. Yeah. That biomass, it's true that these insects do damage to trees, but they're also supporting a lot of diversity. And so it's like about how do you get them to be at a level where they're acceptable for trying to raise healthy trees.
Have you personally seen any plant defense mechanisms against these pests?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think about if I saw anything that like I feel like changed in the plants. I think oak trees are known for like their constitutive defenses, so things like thick leaves that are made of tannins, and they're not so known for like changing their traits in response to insect damage, although it probably happens more than has been documented. I feel like I don't remember seeing plants have any particular response to these insects. It's possible that a plant that's super heavily infested would drop its leaves during the summer, and that would get rid of the insects because they're at that life stage, they're feeding on the leaves, like in the leaf margins as like little tiny insects. So that could be one thing that they would do to just like get rid of their population of these insects.
Yeah, I guess I'd imagine that the street trees too that are planted aren't necessarily selected for or given enough time to like adapt to these pesky situations. Their source of genetics are elsewhere, wherever the city is getting their seeds for these trees, not necessarily like in situ, like their ecological, whatever's going to happen to them next. Their seeds haven't come from these urban spaces necessarily. So
totally, there's not a lot of pre-adaptation, and I think that there are a lot of things that are more important to people who are choosing the cultivars that are planted than insects. I think it's hard to test for resilience to insect pests. It's harder to test for that than it is to look at the color of the leaves and see if it'll be like a nice color for people to look at during the fall. But I do think it would be a good idea to try and select trees that are more resilient to individual insect pests of different like feeding guilds, especially as the climate gets warmer and these communities change. It would be good to be a little bit more purposeful about that.
And I wonder if there's something to be said about having a diversity of species, that if you do have, let's say, the whole tree is planted, the whole street is planted out with willow oaks. I guess it's, providing lots and lots of habitat that's close to each other for the insects to be, where if there's one willow oak and then there's a maple and then there's a sycamore and then there's, something else, that these like specific, maybe more generalist species will still, proliferate, but the really specific ones, it wouldn't be as.
Totally. Yeah. And I think urban foresters who make a lot of the decisions about which trees get planted, to their credit, they are thinking about upping species diversity as much as possible. A lot of times, aesthetics does win out, and entire trees are planted with the same species due to a certain development. But I think a lot of urban foresters, or at least at the city level, trying to make sure that there are a lot of different tree species for things like scale insects, but also for more devastating, like invasive pests, like I'm sure you guys are experiencing the emerald ash borer. And if the entirety of New York City were planted with ash trees right now, would be a very dire time in New York City. So it is super important to diversify the trees that are planted to reduce the likelihood that an entire urban forest could be wiped out by individual pests. But it's also true that like with these sort of more chronic I would call scale insects for the most part more of a chronic issue than an acute one. And I think that increasing species diversity has beneficial impacts for that as well, just because the scale insects don't, they get picked up by the wind, they might end up on the wrong host if you plant a diverse suite of species. Yeah.
Well, and speaking of, we got some more questions that just came in here. Speaking of insects and their populations, Serena asked, is it true that insects are on every continent except Antarctica?
There are insects in Antarctica.
There
Yeah.
you go.
There are insects on every continent. Actually, I was just at the Bohart Museum this morning, and they have a display of like insects in different continents. And the ones from Antarctica were in like some sort of amber material, which made me wonder if maybe those were fossilized or something, but I'm pretty sure there are insects in Antarctica. Happy to be proved wrong on that.
Well, it looks like Ken says that Antarctica has at least one flightless midge,
Yeah.
which sounds like the kind of thing that would be. And going back to what we've been talking about today, we have got a question from Jay here. Is it possible that a drought stress tree would produce fewer tannins, which might make it more prone to infestation by pests? Therefore, that drought is kind of a driver of those infestations.
Yeah, so in our particular system, it doesn't seem like drought is as important, but if you think about, for instance, there are scale insects that feed on xylem instead of phloem. So drought is going to have a bigger effect on xylem because that's the water transport system of the plant. And insects that feed on xylem, there does seem to be a correlation between drought and the insects because there's a higher concentration of nitrogen in their food, which is the water of the plant, if the plant is drought stressed. So yes, that seems to be true. I don't know of any studies looking at effects of drought on tannins in particular. I think that a lot of studies have found to date that most of the effects of drought on insects stem from nutritional quality, like access to nutrients, rather than defenses. But these systems are too complex to imagine that there's no system in which drought is affecting defensive compounds like tannins, and then that's affecting insect fitness. So yes, I totally take your point. It's a possibility. I don't know of any examples.
And I'm also curious about then this study that you have up here now about the vehicle pollution associated with the elevated insect damage, and whether that's something that's the vehicle pollution is affecting the plant defense in some way that's opening it up to insect damage, or whether it's another mechanism.
That's a great parallel, because that is exactly what I think is happening. So I looked at various compounds in the leaves in these like highly polluted versus non-highly polluted trees. And overwhelmingly, it seems like what's happening is that the really polluted trees next to highways are getting eaten a lot by like caterpillars and stuff. And it seems to have something to do with the ability of the plant to defend itself. And so a lot of the defensive compounds are downregulated in those trees next to highways. So yes, that is a system where it's not drought, but it is vehicle pollution that seems to be having some effect on leaf quality. Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that's doubled with probably like predators like wasps and things like that, not having habitat close by in these like highly polluted areas, things like that.
Yeah, we're studying that right now. So we're putting out these little clay caterpillars at our sites that are next to highways and sites that aren't in the trees. And the clay caterpillars, if a bird tries to come up and feed them, they leave like a specific mark. Mm-hmm. And if a parasitoid tries to come and like lay an egg in it, it leaves a different type of mark. So we're going to try to figure out if like these highway adjacent trees are also devoid of bird predation and parasitism. And it's totally possible that it's like, especially it's really loud right next to the highway, and birds that are trying to sing to one another are not going to like that. So it's possible that we're missing out on some of the predation services next to the highways. But we did an experiment where we brought caterpillars into the lab and fed them polluted and non-polluted foliage. So like getting rid of all of the effects of predation. And we still found that the caterpillars, they navigated to the polluted foliage. They ate more of it. They just loved it. And so there's something happening there as well. Yeah.
Does the foliage carry pollutants?
Yeah, it must. So that's something that's been really poorly studied as well. So you can actually see the particulate matter that comes off of tires accumulating on the leaves. And it's also true that nitrogen oxides come out of tailpipes, carbon monoxide comes out of tailpipes and turns into carbon dioxide. Like there are lots of different compounds that could be affecting the leaves. And it could all be happening through deposition on the leaf surface, taking in those compounds when they open their stomata and photosynthesize, but also through the soils. So there are probably a lot of things that are deposited and then come up through the vasculature of the plant. But we don't know the relative impacts of any of those things and how they're affecting the insects yet. So that would be sort of one of the next steps, is figuring out which pollutants are at play and how they're getting up into the plant.
All right, well, I have one more question also, but so if anyone else has something that you want to pop in the chat that we can ask after. I was thinking about, I remember reading about aphids that sometimes if they, I guess, put their mouth parts in the wrong spot, that instead of kind of getting the pressure that will, the products will flow into them, that instead it's the other way and they get themselves sucked into the plant. How do scale insects aim when they're trying to go for the phloem? I mean, is it just kind of chance? Do they have like their mouth parts are a certain length that's gonna, yeah, like what, how do they do that?
Did you say you've heard of this happening with aphids?
Yeah, I don't know if
They
that
create
was
a vacuum and then get, yeah.
not
Wow,
confirmed,
that's
but
cool.
I've heard about it.
Yeah, I've never heard of that before, but that doesn't mean anything. There's a lot in entomology that still blows my mind even after so many years. Yeah, so I don't think that there's a ton that's known about that. I know that people have studied some of that stuff a while back. It's not like a super sexy topic that NSF wants to fund, for instance. I do know that their mouth parts, if you pull them off the plant, they're just like, this little hair essentially. So it seems like they can taste things and then choose where to put their stylet. Like it's really long, and I think it continues to grow throughout their life. So it's malleable and it can go where it wants. So I'm guessing they have some sort of sensory system where they're saying like, this is where I want to be, and I'm going to move if there's no longer, I'm going to move my stylet rather than move my body if this is no longer a good place to eat. But I've never heard of, it would make sense that they have to create a vacuum, right, to be able to pull that fluid up. But I've never heard about them being like having trouble with the physics of that and dealing with the plant. That's really interesting. My general answer is I don't know much about that. And I wish that I did.
Right, it's the same thing. There's so many like sensory things that are happening that are like senses that we don't, like, I don't know, like chemoception, or however these caterpillars are, for example, like able to tell that these leaves have more pollution. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff going on that we don't even have maybe the tools to measure.
Totally. Yeah. People have done a lot of experiments with caterpillars showing like just how complex, there's no other way to put it, how complex their interactions are with plants. So even their saliva, like the plant can detect caterpillar saliva and create defensive compounds based on that. Even if the caterpillar itself doesn't damage the plant, it can like sense the saliva. And caterpillars, chew on plants all the time, navigate to it, decide it's not delicious, and move on. So caterpillars are, yeah, they can be pretty choosy, and their behaviors are very complex and interesting, which has made for like maybe a more, I think maybe I consciously sort of lean toward a more interesting insect for my first work as a faculty member than scale insects. I mean, part of it is that it's really dry here and they're just not as common of an issue for urban foresters as caterpillars are. But another part is just like their complex interactions with trees are just a little bit more engaging.
Especially if you want to attract like students to work and you and stuff. I mean,
Totally. Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
good draw. Nice. All right. Well, unless anyone has any last minute burning questions. Thank you, Emily, so much for this talk. It was super informative, very interesting. And hopefully we'll see you guys next week for a continuation of our plant insect interaction series. We've got, here you go, one more quick thing. Any observations about lace bugs?
They're also sap feeders. And they're really pesty in the southeastern US where I'm from, but they're not in California, maybe. I haven't seen a lace bug in a while. So they do fall in like that category of sap feeding small insect pests that people notice more inside cities than outside cities. And so I suspect that there's a heat effect there too, but I don't know for sure. Yeah.
Great, lots of nice feedback in the chat here.
Yeah, that's nice to see. Thank you all. It's very kind. Okay, I'm gonna hop off. It was really good to chat with you guys. Thank you again for inviting me.
Yes, glad that you could come.
Say hi to Mary for me.
We'll say hi to Mary for you. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
All right, and have a great night, everybody.